Yeah.
For anyone who is vaguely familiar with football, even with just a passing knowledge of the game, when asked what the greatest rivalry in Spain would be, their answer would be fairly predictable. El Clasico, Real Madrid versus Barcelona. But it may be hard to understand for us outside of Spain, but for those who are familiar with the country's culture and football landscape, they point to El Gran Derbi, Sevilla versus Betis, as the greatest derby and rivalry in the country. Seville's marquee match between two of the country's most supported clubs has reached a point where some of the more ardent Real Betis supporters refer to the city of Seville as the Ciudad del Betis, or the City of Betis, in order to avoid even mentioning Sevilla when speaking of their city. Red versus green, a rivalry that divided the city by neighborhoods, has now completely divided the city in a much more minute and tangled way. Where before there were defined lines, now they've blurred, and Betis and Sevilla divide families and households alike. This is Roots of the Rivalry, El Gran Derbi. Hey, I'm Adrian and welcome back to the channel. Great to have you, and I'm excited to get into this one. Oh, and a welcome to all of the new people to the channel. If you find yourself enjoying this video at any point, then consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free, and we got plenty more content for you. All right, let's get into this one, starting with the older of the two clubs, Sevilla FC. All right, here's our due diligence in thanking the Brits for spreading the game around the world. Yay. Thank you, Britain. Because if you've been watching through this series or you do research of your own, you'll know that the Brits, mostly through ship workers, dock hands, rail workers, cable companies, miners, or what have you, all of them are to be thanked for spreading football around the world. And of course, Sevilla Football Club is no exception. Sevilla aren't the oldest club in Spain, but they're close, man. Where Sevilla were founded on January 25th, 1890, RC Recreativo de Huelva, another Andalusian club, were founded 1 month earlier on December 23rd, 1889. Sevilla fell short by 33 days. Now, there are some who like to say that Sevilla is in fact the oldest club in Spain, pointing to the fact that Recreativo de Huelva wasn't solely devoted to football, whereas Sevilla Football Club was. I mean, a lot of football clubs that exist in the world today started out as just sporting clubs or recreational clubs, but they still point towards when the club was actually started rather than when the football team within that club was actually started as their foundational date. So take from that what you will. But hey, at least as they make sure to mention in their official history books, they are indeed the oldest club in Seville. Now, who founded the club? You already know it was some Brits, but which flavor of Brits? Scottish, yes, two Scots and a Seville local founded Sevilla FC, Edward Farquharson Johnston, who would be named as the first president of the club, Isaias White Mendez, the first secretary, and Hugh McCull, the second Scotsman and the club's first captain. There were plenty of Brits involved in the founding of the club due to the fact that there were plenty of Brits settled in the city of Seville. A few of them, like the aforementioned Johnson and McCall, met in a local cafe with Brits and locals alike to have a Burns Supper, which is the annual celebration of Scottish poet Robert Burns every January 25th. While there, they discussed their desire to start a local football club, which would be the first of its kind in Seville, and agreed upon the name. The rules of the football they would play, association football rather than an iteration of rugby, and the officials that would manage the club, whom we went over a moment ago. Their first match would be on March 8th, 1890, taking on none other than Recreativo Huelva, and going on to beat them 2-0 at the Tablada Hippodrome in Seville in the first official match in Spanish football history. The first scorer, Ritzen, who would later go down in history as the first goal scorer in an official match in Spanish football history. So shout out Ritzen. Sevilla would go on to be a dominant side in Andalusia, and as teams would crop up in Seville, they too would most often lose to Sevilla FC. Just to show you how much Sevilla cares about their rivalry, on their official website, they make sure to say that they are the most successful club from Andalusia, and even go on to mention how they have won the Andalusian Cup more than anyone else. That ended in 1940. Which is true. They had a dominant run of winning the cup 18 out of the 21 times it was held. But going back to 1909, an inter-club divide surrounding the signing of a player from the Triana neighborhood would eventually birth their greatest rivals. before we get to that, a club named Seville Balompié was founded in 1907 by students from the Polytechnic School in Seville. They wore blue and white kits, and according to the official history books from Real Betis, Balompié was chosen by the students to distance themselves from the intrinsically English football club trend that was very apparent in Spain. Seville was no exception, of course. Balompié is just an antiquated Spanish word for football, balom meaning ball, and pied meaning foot. So yes, as mentioned, in 1909, Sevilla FC allegedly, more on this in a sec, refused to sign a player from the Triana neighborhood of the city. Some of the people involved in the club took offense to this and didn't understand why their peers were turning up their noses at this player and acting a bit elitist, to say the least. So without finding a way to come to a conclusion that satisfied everybody, some members of Sevilla FC broke off to form a rival club called Betis Football Club. Now, I said allegedly earlier about this player signing story because history tends to be spiced up a bit as time goes on, like a long game of telephone, especially when relying upon oral history and various newspaper clippings to fill in the gaps. So I'm not necessarily discrediting the claim, but there's definitely grounds to question the reason for the disagreement. But here's what we can take as fact. There was a disagreement within Sevilla FC in 1909 from which members of the club splintered off and formed Betis Football Club. In 1913, Betis Football Club was dissolved. But in 1914, Betis Football Club came alive again, at least the people behind it, and they joined forces with another Sevilla club in who? Seville Balompié, the team that was founded in 1907. And so after getting their royal patronage from the then King of Spain, they became Real Bétis Balompié. By the way, the word Betis was the old Roman word for the Guadalquivir River, which flows through Seville. And so Real Betis always points to 1907 as their founding year, given that that was the year that Sevilla Balompié was founded. But it's interesting to consider that there is definitely some Sevilla FC, their rivals, DNA in the foundational history of the club, no? The rivalry between the two is pre-baked into them thanks to their origins. It's similar but different, of course, to Inter and AC Milan's foundational relationship. If you're not aware of that, I, of course, did a video on it. Anyway, the fact that Sevilla Balompié won the Sevilla Cup in 1910 will have created a rivalry between the two clubs. Then they won it again in 1914, and in December of 1914, the merger was approved and made official. And thus, Real Betis Balompié as you know it now. And so what's at the root of this rivalry? Well, we know that initial inflection point, but let's get a little deeper into this. These two teams are always intertwined, even achieving promotion back into LaLiga together in the 2000-2001 season, and this penchant for being attached at the hip in some ways on the pitch reaches off of the pitch as well. While it would be easy to point to Madrid and Barcelona as the two football capitals of Spain, the city of Seville lives and breathes football and is one of the exceptional cities within Spain where finding supporters of Real Madrid or FC Barcelona is a bit harder to come by, as Seville is well and truly divided between the red and white of Sevilla and the green and white of Real Betis. In many other cities, the dominance of Real Madrid and Barca is still felt, but not in Seville. And what adds to this rivalry within the city even further, in other cities there's often one club that eclipses the other as far as stature goes, but in Seville, they're relatively equal. Well, Sevilla certainly has a few more Europa League titles to boast about, don't they? But also, the fact that Andalusia and Seville, by extension, is one of the early sort of birthplaces of football in Spain, given two of the oldest clubs in the country come from Andalusia. So football is a very, very serious topic in Seville. And the aforementioned intertwining of their fates off of the pitch reaches to how deeply divided the city is. Today, you will find not just the city divided, not just family and friend groups divided, but the division between red and green gets to a level where there can be divisions within the same household. So where did this start? Is it simply just a turf battle, or is there another divide as well? Well, let's go back to 1914 again, when the two merger clubs, Betis Football Club and Sevilla Balompié, combined and were also given their royal title, their Real title, by then Spanish King Alfonso XIII, thus becoming Real Betis Balompié. Getting this royal patronage was not taken too kindly by Sevilla supporters, especially since the merging of Betis Football Club and Seville Balompié was already seen as an act of war against Sevilla FC, according to urban pitch writer Ignasi Tornegualdo. In 1915, the first Seville Derby was played between these two teams. Sevilla won, and they began showing off a trophy that they had won from the match to rub it in the faces of the newly established Royal Merger Club. Clearly, Betis and their supporters didn't take too kindly to this, and thus the rivalry began to grow and grow year upon year. What's interesting about this royal patronage of Betis is that it somewhat, I guess, flies in the face of the early social divide between these two fan bases. Of course, as we know, these social divides often don't stand true today, but they certainly played a massive role in the fabric of their shared history and rivalry. In the early days, Sevilla FC was supported by the more successful and wealthier Seville residents, as their home ground, Ramon Sanchez Pizjuan, was located in Nervión, an affluent and powerful part of the city, and remains a nice part of the city to this day. Betis, on the other hand, has their home ground, the Benito Villamarín, in an area that was formerly just the outskirts of town, as you can see here in 1929, the year it was finished. That area is called Heliópolis, and was formerly made up of working class people who couldn't afford to live in town. Since then, however, the town of Seville has expanded greatly, and thus the Benito Villamarín was absorbed by the city. And it's a great area now. From this, the divide was entrenched further with the various divides in Spain following the Spanish Civil War, and the ideas of the proletariats versus the capitalists were heard far more often. One such example, as noted by Sid Lowe, came in 1945 when Betis player Francisco Antunes left the club trading green for red. The Betis supporters did all they could to stop him, including trying to stop him from boarding a train to Madrid to sign the transfer papers. They failed in doing so, despite even resorting to the fans collecting donations in a bid to try to get Antunes to stay with Betis. Word got to a famous Spanish communist and orator, Dolores Ibarruri, aka La Pasionaria, who was hiding in Moscow at the time. And she said on Radio Moscow that the transfer from Betis to Sevilla was, quote, another assault launched by the oligarchy against the working classes, an injustice committed by a capitalist team against a proletarian one. Again, just to reiterate, these ideas of working class versus the rich and powerful aren't true to this day. The social lines have been blurred, as they have been with most fan bases around the world, but this gives you an idea of how deeply ingrained the divide had been between the two sets of supporters. You want more to convince how much they despise each other? Well, Dmitry Cheryshev, yes, the father of Denis, was a footballer back in the day who represented Sporting Gijón. Stick with me here for a moment. I know you're probably wondering, what does that club have to do with anything? Back during the 1996-97 season, Betis was hosting Sporting Gijón in one of the final days of the season. Cheryshev ended up scoring what was the winning goal in a 1-0 win for Gijón, and to his surprise, the entire Benito Villamarín stadium erupted in cheers upon Cheryshev's scoring. And it gets weirder. In speaking to ESPN, Cheryshev looked back on the day, saying, quote, when we got to the ground on the bus, Betis fans were waiting for us, cheering. You go out to warm up, and they're applauding. You miss a chance, and they go, hooey. They encourage you to keep attacking. You score, and they cheer. You look for your fans in the corner, but it's the whole stadium cheering. And Cheryshev's teammate on the day, David Cano, expands further, saying, quote, you're thinking, what's going on? We got to the city, the airport, and there are Betis fans cheering you. At the hotel, they're there. It was as if we were playing at home. On the way to the ground, they had lined the route chanting, Sporting, Sporting. I was on the bench to start with, and sitting there, you could hear the fans behind you. We had to win, and they wanted us to win. Every time we got the ball, they were urging us forward. Okay, so why was the entire stadium against their own team? Why were their own incredibly devoted fans cheering against Betis? Well, Sporting Gijón and Sevilla were in a relegation dogfight, and a win for Gijón would mean that Sevilla would be relegated. And that's exactly what happened. Both Cano and Cheryshev stand by that Betis didn't make it easy, and that it was the support of the crowd that pushed Gijón through. Funnily enough, the Betis supporters whistled their own players every time they would attack. All of this in the name of seeing their rivals go down. And would you believe it if I told you that the same thing happened again 3 years later, except this time it was Betis going down and Sevilla's supporters cheering against their own team? Well, it did indeed happen as Sevilla, who actually were already condemned to relegation, lay down for Real Oviedo, the team that achieved safety at Betis' expense. And I mean, they really lay down for them, to the point where plenty of newspapers called the display a pantomime, as El País wrote, a tragic comic, shameful, and that it sullies the sport. This is how deep the rivalry runs. Both teams returned to LaLiga after just a single season in the second division, but this is what they are willing to do in order to hurt their opponents. These two sides are forever intertwined, relegated together, promoted together, dividing the city together. And if you go way back to the beginning of Betis, as we went over already in many ways, they were partially born from what would become their biggest rivals. Sometimes there are no bigger rivalries than a sibling rivalry. No greater rival than that within your own city, neighborhood, or household. And the Seville Derby, Gran Derbi, the Great Derby, is perhaps the greatest within Spain. I hope that you guys enjoyed this one. The Seville Derby is definitely an under-celebrated and underrated derby within the world of football, but as I mentioned earlier, when you speak to people from Spain, when you want to talk about the biggest derby within the country, it's El Gran Derbi. If you're new here, consider subscribing for more videos like this and plenty of other explainers, but beyond that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Ciao.